The courtroom was packed that morning, the air thick with anticipation as the judge took his seat. It was a high-profile trial, the kind of case that would make headlines for weeks. The defendant, a man in his early 40s, stood at the center of the room, facing a series of serious charges. As the jury filed in and the proceedings began, everyone in the room was focused on the case. Everyone except Judge Samuel Davis. Judge Davis, a seasoned and stoic man in his late 50s, had seen it all. His years of experience in the justice system had taught him to keep his emotions in check, to stay detached from the personal stories that sometimes seeped into the courtroom. But today was different. As the defendant's name was called, Mark Harris, a wave of recognition hit Judge Davis like a ton of bricks. For a brief moment, the noise of the courtroom faded into the background, and he was transported back in time. The man standing in front of him, accused of heinous crimes, was someone he hadn't thought about in years. Mark Harris was his childhood friend, someone he had grown up with in a small town in the heart of the Midwest. The memories flooded back. Long summer days spent playing baseball in the park, shared secrets whispered under the stars, and the bond they had forged in their youth. How could this be? Mark, the boy who had once been his closest friend, now stood before him as a criminal defendant. How had things gone so terribly wrong? Judge Davis's mind raced, but his face remained stoic. He couldn't afford to let his personal history with Mark influence the trial. But the recognition stirred something deep inside him. The last time he had seen Mark, they were both young men with bright futures ahead of them. What had happened to lead Mark down this path? The judge's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, trying to refocus. He couldn't allow this to cloud his judgment. But he knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary trial. There was a history here, a history that could very well shake the foundations of this courtroom. As Mark was led to the defendant's seat, the judge took a deep breath, silently wrestling with the internal conflict he now faced. What would happen next? The story that had begun long ago was about to take an unexpected turn, and no one in the room knew just how much it would change everything. The trial continued, but Judge Samuel Davis couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu that lingered in the air. Mark Harris, the man now accused of embezzlement, fraud, and other financial crimes, was no longer the boy he remembered. His once bright eyes now seemed clouded with guilt, and the air of defiance he had carried in his youth had transformed into a somber, almost defeated demeanor. As the prosecution presented its evidence, the weight of the case seemed to bear down on everyone in the room. Documents were presented, witnesses were called, and it was clear that Mark had been deeply involved in the web of corruption that had destroyed several businesses and ruined the lives of countless people. Yet, despite the severity of the charges, Judge Davis couldn't help but think back to a simpler time, a time when Mark had been a friend, a brother even. When the defense attorneys stood to speak, Judge Davis's mind snapped back to the present. His gaze flickered over to Mark, who seemed to shrink under the weight of the judge's stare. It was then that something unexpected happened. The defense attorney's words echoed through the courtroom, but they weren't about the case. They were about Mark's past. "Your Honor, my client," the defense attorney began, "is not the same man he once was. The pressure of years in the business world, combined with personal struggles that many of you are unaware of, led him down a dark path. A path of deceit and betrayal. But let me explain something that no one here knows." A hush fell over the courtroom. The tension was palpable. Judge Davis's pulse quickened as he leaned forward, instinctively aware that something was about to change the course of the trial. "The man you see before you today," the defense attorney continued, "is not only a man who fell from grace, but also someone who was betrayed by the very people who were supposed to help him. In fact, Mark Harris has been carrying a burden that none of you would ever believe. The defense attorney's eyes turned toward Mark. For years, he's been living in the shadow of a terrible secret, one that only he knows, and one that ties him directly to the events leading up to this trial. Judge Davis's mind raced. Was the defense attorney suggesting there was more to this story than he realized? He watched Mark closely, seeing the slight tremor in his hands and the pained look in his eyes. Was Mark trying to convey something unspoken? And then, the words that came next made the courtroom freeze in shock. "I'm not just here to defend a criminal, Your Honor," the defense attorney said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm here to reveal that Mark Harris is the victim of a long-standing conspiracy, one that started when he was a child. A conspiracy that involved people he trusted most, including someone very close to you, Judge Davis." Judge Davis's breath caught in his throat. He had heard enough. He stood up suddenly, his voice firm, but the sense of panic was undeniable. "Enough," he shouted. "I will not tolerate these baseless claims. This is a court of law, not a place for wild accusations." But even as the judge's words rang out, a part of him knew that the defense attorney's claims were about to open up a much deeper, more dangerous story. One that involved him, his childhood, and possibly the very people he had once called family. Later that day, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He tried to go through the motions, catching up on paperwork, answering routine calls, but his mind kept drifting back to the man he'd spat on. Who was he? Why had he been so calm? It was like he'd known something Jake didn't. Around 3 p.m., the precinct received an unexpected visit from the police commissioner, an official usually seen only at the most significant meetings. The officers, including Jake, gathered in the briefing room, exchanging uneasy glances. The commissioner was a serious man, a career officer with a strict reputation. He stood at the front, scanning the room with a hard stare. Behind him, a tall, well-dressed man stood with a briefcase in hand. The man looked strangely familiar to Jake, but he couldn't place where he'd seen him before. "Good afternoon, everyone," the commissioner began, his tone grave. "I have some important news. Today, Ridgeview Police Department has a new leader." The officers exchanged puzzled glances. Was this some sort of joke? "Effective immediately," the commissioner continued, "our new chief of police has arrived. Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Chief Sam Walker." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but what caught him off guard was the man standing next to the commissioner, the very same man he had encountered earlier that morning in the precinct. The man who had been so calm despite Jake's aggression. The room fell into stunned silence as Chief Walker gave a brief nod to the officers. He wasn't wearing a police uniform, but his confident posture, sharp eyes, and the way he carried himself suggested he was no stranger to authority. Jake's mouth went dry. This couldn't be happening. The commissioner motioned toward Jake. "Officer Mitchell, if you'd step forward." Jake took a hesitant step, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yes, sir," he stammered, his mind racing. "Do you remember this man?" the commissioner asked, his voice almost too calm. "Sam Walker, our new chief." Jake's face flushed crimson as he realized what was happening. The man he had spat on earlier, he was the new chief? His stomach twisted with a combination of embarrassment and dread. This wasn't just any officer or civilian. This was someone who held the highest rank in the department now. Jake's mind raced to make sense of what had just unfolded. Chief Walker stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried, "I believe we had an unpleasant encounter earlier today." Jake couldn't meet his eyes. He felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him, and the weight of his actions came crashing down. He'd been reckless, judgmental, and unprofessional, and now, it seemed, he was paying the price. The other officers in the room seemed to shrink back, the tension palpable. They all knew what had happened. They were witnessing the fallout. I'd like to think that every person deserves respect, regardless of their appearance or background, Chief Walker continued, his voice even but firm. But I can understand that not everyone agrees with that philosophy. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides, fighting the urge to apologize, to say something that would ease the tension. But he knew it was too late for apologies. The damage had already been done. And as for you, Chief Walker said, turning his attention to the commissioner, I think it's time we discuss the future of this department. His tone left no room for argument. It was clear that Chief Walker was in complete control, despite his calm demeanor. Jake stood frozen, his breath shallow. He didn't know what the next step would be, but one thing was certain. The reality of his actions had just hit him like a ton of bricks, and now he would have to live with the consequences. The rest of the meeting continued, but Jake barely heard a word. His mind was focused on one thing. How would Chief Walker handle the situation? Would this cost him his job? Would the entire department turn against him? In the back of his mind, Jake couldn't help but wonder if this would be the beginning of his downfall, or if, somehow, he could salvage the mess he created. All he knew was that this moment, this unthinkable encounter, had changed everything. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Davis's heart raced as the defense attorney's words echoed in his mind. A conspiracy? Involving someone close to him? His thoughts swirled, but he knew one thing for certain. The course of this trial had just taken an unimaginable turn. Your Honor, the defense attorney pressed on, his voice steady despite the shockwave he had just set in motion. I know this is difficult to hear, but it's the truth. Mark Harris was set up by people in positions of power, people who once promised to protect him, people who turned his life upside down. Judge Davis's hands gripped the sides of his bench as he stared at the man before him, Mark Harris. Could it be true? Could the man he had once called his best friend be telling the truth about this dark conspiracy? The courtroom murmured with confusion, but all eyes were on the judge. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in his long career, Judge Davis wasn't sure how to proceed. Judge Davis, the defense attorney continued, I know this will be hard for you to believe, but it was you, Your Honor. You were part of this, whether you realize it or not. The words hit like a slap in the face. The judge's mind reeled. He had always been careful, always kept his personal life separate from his professional career. How could this be happening? He had always believed he had a clear conscience. And yet, here he was, standing at the crossroads of his past and present, unsure of what to believe. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Eyes shifted from the judge to the defense attorney, from the judge to Mark Harris. There was a heavy pause before Mark finally spoke. It's true, Mark said, his voice low but clear. You don't remember, Samuel, but when we were young, your family was involved in something far darker than you could have ever known. You and I were both pawns in a game we couldn't understand at the time. But it's all coming to light now. Judge Davis felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. His mind flashed back to his childhood, to the secret meetings he had witnessed between his father and powerful men. He had always assumed they were about business, about growing their family's wealth and influence. But now, with Mark's words hanging in the air, the truth started to take shape. As the realization set in, the judge's heart sank. He remembered the strange disappearance of some people from their small town, the unexplained events that had occurred shortly after he left for law school. He had distanced himself from it all, burying it in the back of his mind, thinking it was simply the paranoia of youth. But Mark was telling him something that he could no longer ignore. I didn't know, the judge whispered, barely able to form the words. I didn't know it was that bad. Mark nodded, his eyes full of a sorrow that only years of carrying such a heavy secret could bring. You were just a kid, Samuel. But you were connected. And now it's all catching up with us. The judge stood, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. His career, his life, everything he had worked for, it was all now tangled in a web of lies and betrayal. He glanced at Mark, the childhood friend he had never imagined he would see in such circumstances. The courtroom waited for the judge to speak, but words failed him. What could he say? What could he do? His professional integrity was on the line, but more importantly, the bond he had once shared with Mark had been shattered in a way he never expected. "I have to recuse myself from this case," Judge Davis said, his voice barely audible. "There's more to this than I can handle. I must step down." With that, the judge left the bench, his career and personal life forever altered. As he walked out of the courtroom, he realized that his past was no longer something he could hide from. The conspiracy had been set in motion long ago, and the truth would continue to haunt him. And as for Mark Harris, he was no longer just the accused. He was the man who had brought the judge face to face with the shocking reality of their shared past, a past that would now define both of their futures.